Hi everyone, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew and welcome to my full bust adjustment tutorial. Now this video is going to be sort of part one when it comes to my full bust adjustment tutorials. I'm going to be showing you how to do a basic or a sort of standard full bust adjustment with a garment that has a single dart on the side seam. And we're also going to be discussing how you might choose what size garment to make and how much of a full bust adjustment to add into your garment. First, I would recommend that you do watch my What Is tutorial, because in my What Is tutorial, I do discuss why you might need a full bust adjustment and also the fitting issues that you might have in a garment that mean that you need to do a full bust adjustment. So watch that first and then come and join me here where we can actually chat more about picking the right size and I can show you how to do this basic FBA. Further on from this tutorial, I'm going to be adding more tutorials that are going to be showing you how to do FBA and SBAs, so small bust adjustments, on different kinds of garments. So by doing a full bust adjustment, we are going to be adding width and length to the bust area. We want to add more fabric so that there's enough space for the fabric to go up and over the bust and also around the bust. Now, if you've watched my What Is tutorial, you will understand that when we're referring to cup sizes, we're referring to the cup size of a pattern, which is different to your bra cup size. The first step of any FBA is to always measure your high bust and your full bust. You can learn how to measure those in the What Is tutorial. Once you have those measurements, you can start to think about what size pattern or what size garment you're going to be making. And unfortunately, this is all a little bit of trial and error. It depends on the pattern you're working, the pattern company, and how they drafted other aspects of the garment as well as the bust. Let's talk about a couple of examples. The first one is that perhaps you have already made a garment. You've made a garment and it fits you really nicely at the shoulders, neckline, armholes, but it's too tight over the bust. It looks like it's squashing your bust. Perhaps you have drag lines between the busts, or you even have drag lines coming from the bust into the side seam. Now, with that situation, you're going to want to stick with the pattern size that you have already made because it fits you nicely in all the other places. What you are going to need to do though is to do an FBA to give yourself more space right over those bust areas. So how much would you add? Well, it will depend on the pattern. If the pattern is a sort of standard dressmaking pattern, most of those patterns are drafted for a Bcup. That means that there is a 2-inch, 5cm difference between the high bust and the full bust. If you want to learn more about the differences and the cup size, please again watch the What Is tutorial. So as I said, most patterns are drafted for a Bcup. Perhaps you are a C or a D cup. If you were a C cup, it would mean that your bust was 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters larger than your high bust. In that case, you would just need to add a 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters of extra fabric in as a full bust adjustment because we're saying the pattern is a B cup. You are a C cup, so we need to increase the cup in the pattern for your individual figure. Now, always remember when we're working on the pattern that we're always going to be working on one half of the front, or most of the time you'll be working on one half of the front. Therefore, that 1 inch that you need to add, that's between both cup sizes. So you're going to simply add half an inch to the half of the front that we're working on, 1.25 centimeters. So that's a good place to start. But what if you haven't made the garment before, you haven't made a sample of the garment, and you want to sort of try and get as close as possible when you do make your sample? Where do you start? What pattern size do you choose? Well, the method that I generally take is that you're going to want to take your high bust measurement and you're going to want to add the cup size that the pattern is drafted for. So if that was a B cup, that would be 5 centimeters, 2 inches. If it was a C cup, it would be 3 inches, 7.5 centimeters. Let's look at an example. So say your high bust measures 34 inches. Doesn't matter if we're working in inches or centimeters here, just follow along. So we've got a 34-inch high bust. The pattern that we're working with is drafted for a B cup, like most dressmaking patterns. That means that there would be 2 inches on top of the high bust. If we take your high bust of 34 and add 2 inches, that gives us 36. So we would pick the pattern for the 36 bust. And that's our starting point. However, your bust measures 38, which means that your bust is 2 inches larger than the 36 pattern that you've chosen. You're going to need to do an FBA to increase the pattern by 2 inches. So remember, half of the body that we're working on, that's only going to be 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters. And that should make sense because we're saying your high bust was 34, your full bust was 38. Your difference was 4 inches, 10 centimeters. That's a D-cup. We're increasing the pattern by 2 inches. Every cup size is 1 inch, so we're taking it from a B to a C to a D. And that is generally a really good starting point. The only other time that I might amend that and start slightly differently is if you have an extremely large bust. Now, generally speaking, as your bust increases, it doesn't necessarily mean that your frame increases, your shoulders, your armholes, your neck. So, if you have an extremely large bust, what I would recommend is that you pick the garment bust size measurement, so the size you're making in the garment where it says bust on the pattern, and you use your high bust for that measurement. Let's look at an example. So perhaps your high bust measures 44 inches. Your full bust measures 48 inches. Well, you could choose the pattern for the 44-inch bust. And that's your high bust measurement. So obviously that isn't going to fit your full bust. What you're then going to need to do is to look at the difference between your high bust, 44 inches, your full bust, 48 inches. That's 4 inches, 10 centimeters. So you will need to do an FBA of 4 inches, 10 centimeters. Divide that again, we're working on half of the pattern, 2 inches, 5 centimeters on the one side. As I said, I only tend to use this technique if you have an extremely large bust, and if you were to use the technique I mentioned previously by doing the high bust plus the cup size, the top here would end up too large for you. It is a little bit of trial and error, and it is going to be a case of seeing what size fits you well through the neck, the shoulders and armholes, that then you need to do a full bust adjustment too. You're also going to want to consider how much ease the pattern has. Now, ease is the difference between your body measurements and the finished garment measurements of the pattern. If a garment has a lot of ease, then you may get away with doing less of an FBA or not doing an FBA at all because there is enough room around the bust for your bust. Unfortunately, this is going to be a little bit of trial and error, and you're going to need to see how you get on with each individual pattern company. So, now that you know where you're going to start, or at least have an idea of your starting points, we're going to go to our pattern. I'm working with a pattern, as I said, that has a single side dart. You could, if you haven't got a pattern like this, just perhaps draw one out and copy along, just so that you understand this technique, and perhaps you could keep it to one side for when you do have a pattern like this that you need to do an FBA on. So, grab your pattern and we can begin. So here is my pattern, and my pattern has got a single side dart. The first step is that you're going to need to mark the bust apex or find the bust apex on the pattern that you're working with. If you are unsure how to find a bust apex on your pattern because it doesn't have one, then I do have a tutorial that shows you how to find the bust apex or get as close to it as possible. I'll pop a link to that here. Now, most of the time I will do a full bust adjustment working with the bust apex that exists with the pattern. That's because when you're doing a full bust adjustment, you are shifting and moving the pattern quite a lot. The bust apex will move and it will become lower because remember, we're adding length over the bust here. So generally speaking, leave the bust apex where it is, do the full bust adjustment, and then you can look into moving your dart to work with your bust apex if you need to. Now we're going to begin by drawing some lines on the pattern. You're going to need a ruler and you're going to need a pencil. I'm working with Sharpie so that it's clear for you to see. The first line that you're going to draw is from the centre of the dart, the side dart we're working with here, and you can either measure that to find the centre, Or if your dart has been trued like mine has, you might have a point that shows where the centre is. The line that we're going to draw is from the centre of the dart at the side seam through the point of the dart to the bust apex, just like so. Now, the next line you're going to draw is a line from the bust apex down to the waist, or down to the bottom of your pattern piece. Now, you want to make sure that this line is parallel to the grain line. This is the centre front in my case. So I'm going to use my ruler and the lines on my ruler here to make sure that they are parallel to the grain line, and then I will draw another line in. The next line that I'm going to draw is from the bust apex to the armhole. Now, you want this line to be approximately 1/3 of the armhole. So if you divided the armhole into 3, it would be 1/3 of the way from the underarm, or from the side seam. And it's approximately the notch for this pattern, just like so. Now, the other thing we need to do with the armhole here is that if your pattern has got seam allowances already included on it, you're going to need to draw the seam allowance on here. This bit's really important. So I'm going to take a different colour Sharpie and I'm going to measure in my seam allowance just around this little section where this line is. My seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, so I'm going to do a couple of dotted lines. Obviously yours might be different, or you might not have a seam allowance on the pattern, in which case don't worry. The next step is to grab a pair of scissors because we need to do some cutting. We are going to cut up this line here. So this is the line that goes from the bottom of the garment or the waist all the way up to the bust apex. And we're going to continue through to the armhole. However, we want to stop at where that stitching line is. We don't want to continue cutting through to the edge of the paper. And I'll show you why we want to do that in a second. So using the scissors, I'm going to cut from the bottom of the garment or the waist, seam, whatever garment it is that you're working with, all the way up to the bust apex. At the bust apex, we're going to turn and continue cutting up to the armhole, stopping at the red marking for my stitching line. So now we have a cut all the way from the waist or the bottom of the garments, all the way up through the bust apex and up to where your stitching line or seam allowance starts at the armhole. Now we need to cut at the armhole from the edge of the paper to the stitching line or the seam allowance edge. This is because we don't want to amend the stitching line of the armhole. And you'll see this as we start to work further with the piece. And you will understand this a little bit more in a second. If your pattern doesn't have a seam allowance here, then by all means you can cut all the way up this line, but not through at the edge of the paper. You want to have a little hinge there. So we're going to do the same. We're going to cut down, but we're not going to cut through. We want to leave a very small little bit of paper still joining the paper together along that stitching line. Okay, be gentle with your pattern piece because with all these cuts, it does get a little bit weak. The next cut is through the center of the dart here, from the side seam all the way up through the center of the dart, up to the bust apex, but not through. You want to be leaving 2 to 3 millimeters, a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch of paper still attached so that it will create a hinge. And you will see that again in a second, why we need that hinge. So I have made the cuts. I cut from the waist, bottom of the garment, up through the bust apex, up to the stitching line. I then cut, because my pattern has seam allowances on it, from the edge of the paper up to the stitching line. I also cut from the side seam of the dart, up through the dart, up to the bust apex, but not through. Now you can see what happens. I'm going to grab some tape and I'm just going to tape down this front panel here. And this is just so that it doesn't move and so that you can see what I'm doing. You're welcome to do the same. Okay, so that bit is taped. What we're now going to do is we want to separate the pattern pieces here. Now we are using this tiny bit of paper that we left attached along that stitching line as a hinge. Can you see that? And this is where that was important. If you didn't have seam allowances, this would be the edge of your piece of paper. But because we do have seam allowances, we need to make sure that the stitching line of the armhole doesn't change. That needs to be the same. So our hinge is right on that stitching line. And I'm opening it like so. Now, when you are doing a full bust adjustment, we are adding paper in here. What we need to be doing is this line here is nice and straight. You drew that so that it was parallel to the grain line. We still want this part of the pattern to also be straight and parallel to the grain line. So what we're going to do is to pivot on the hinge at the point of the bust apex again that went through the dart to bring these two pieces parallel to one another. And this is the full bust adjustment. You are gaining fabric over the fullest part of the bust here and also in the center of the dart. The amount that you need to add to your full bust adjustment needs to be this amount here. Now, when you do this, you can either pop some paper underneath, or you can get your pattern in position and you can stick it onto a cutting mat, you can pin it onto a cork board, and then you can trace it off. Either method, it doesn't matter. I'm going to stick mine down because I think it makes it nice and clear that I've got this grey behind. Now you're going to need to know how much you want to add, and the amount that you add for your FBA is the distance between this line and this line. Both of these should be parallel to one another, parallel to the grain line. So if we look back at our example number 1, remember we chose a pattern for a 36-inch bust, but our full bust was 38 inches. So we needed to gain 2 inches in an FBA over the bust. But that 2 inches is the total amount we need. So we can have 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters on this side, because when we cut out your garment, that's going to give you 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters on one bust, and the same on the other bust. We're working on half of the front, remember here. So what I would do is I would measure from this line here, 1 inch, and I would draw that on, just like so. Next, I'm going to bring this piece so that it matches up with that 1 inch line. So I've got a 1 inch, 2 parallel lines 1 inch apart here, or the distance that your full bust adjustment is. The amount that you have to add in here, if I had to add in more, would create a larger dart. So I'm going to tape that down on the 1 inch line, put a couple of bits of tape in there. So we've now added in the full bust adjustment here. We've got that width in there. This has caused the dart to be larger, to work with the larger cup size. However, can you see at the bottom edge here? They don't match up. The side is longer than the front. So we need to drop the front to match up with the new side. Now, the easiest way that I find to do that is you're going to want to draw a line across the front piece. It doesn't really matter where this is, but I generally like to draw mine in line with that bust apex again. I make sure that this is at a right angle to the grain line. And then we're going to grab some scissors and we're going to cut through this horizontal line. Now what I like to do here is to draw a line along the bottom edge of the side piece so that we're bringing it down by the amount it needs, and also to draw a line in line with the center front edge. Make sure all these lines are square and parallel. Then you can slot this little piece back in, making sure that the center front edge is lined up and the bottom edge is now lined up with your side panel. And again, we can stick this down. Just make sure here that you're being cautious with all of your lines being right angles. You want everything to be parallel and a right angle when it needs to be. So we have now added that extra length that we spoke about. Remember, we wanted to add width here and also length to compensate for the larger cup size. Now we're going to need to redraw our dart legs. Now, this is going to depend on where you want your dart to finish. As I spoke about in the beginning, your bust apex has moved here. it has moved from where it was up here, down, and also towards the side seam. This may or may not be in the right place for you. As a good starting point, I often just go and draw the dart legs as they currently are and extend them. Let me show you. So I will simply extend that dart leg and extend the other dart leg like so. And that gives us perhaps a starting point for where this dart should be. However, depending on where your bust apex is, this may be too close, it may be too far away. So you could have a look here about applying your bust apex onto the pattern and then drawing the dart to work with your bust apex. Or you could just do what I've done here and make a mock-up, make a sample garment and take a look. Take a look as to whether this dart works for you, whether the amount of the FBA you have added in works for you. I would always recommend making a sample garment whenever you make a big adjustment like this. If you find that you need to reposition your dart, raise it, lower it, or perhaps just move the dart point, then please watch my tutorial that shows you how to do this. The other reason why it's good to make a sample garment is because your dart has ended up much larger than it was originally. So you've got a couple of options here. If your dart is very large, and I would count this to be quite large, you will find that the dart bulk, it just doesn't sit quite as flat in the finished garment. Therefore, you may want to make what I refer to as a cutaway dart, where instead of having the dart bulk here, you have a seam. Again, this is a good reason to test your sample garment because you want to check that the dart is in the right place, that everything works, before making this a cutaway dart. And I'll pop a tutorial that shows you how to make a cutaway dart here. Another option is that you could do some dart manipulation. Again, I have another tutorial that shows you all about dart manipulation, where you could reduce the size of this dart by putting in a second dart somewhere else, perhaps at the waist. Or you could create two darts on the size of the body. And I will have a tutorial that shows you how to make one dart into two darts very soon. Now, the other thing that you need to consider is this extra amount of fabric that you've got going all the way down the bodice or garment. This could be to your waist, like mine is here, or if you've got a garment that goes all the way down to the hem, then it could be the hem of the top or the hem of the dress. Do you need this extra fabric in here? Now, I would often recommend doing a full bust adjustment before you do any grading between the sizes because of this extra amount. You might find that actually you need this extra amount through the waist and through the hip. You might not. So, what are your options? First one is, as I said, you leave it. You need that extra amount through the front of your body at the waist and at the hip. That's absolutely fine. We leave it as it is. The second options, and the third option, is that we don't need it. So what do you do then? One option is to add in a waist dart. This is if this was perhaps going to be seamed into a skirt. We could add a waist dart. So how would we do that? We're going to need to add a waist dart, the width of the amount that we added. Most of the time, your waist dart is going to want to be below the bust apex. So again, it might be a good idea to knock up a sample here, check your bust apex is in the right place first, and then we can look at adding in the waist dart. But for now, we will say that our bust apex, perfect, we're spot on the new location. So the centre of the dart is going to be parallel to the grain line up to that bust apex. So I'm pretty much on this cut line here because that was going to the centre of the bust apex. I will draw that in black so that you can see. Now, the width at the bottom of the dart is that 1 inch. So I'm going to do ½ an inch on either side. So this is 2.5 centimetres. I'm simply dividing half, 1.25 on one side, and the other half, 1.25 on the other side. Now I need to decide on the point of the dart point. How close to the bust apex do I want that to be? Now, and this is where it comes into consideration for your other dart as well. It really depends on your shape. Generally speaking, the larger your cup size or the larger your bust, the further away you want your dart point to be. And it depends on your shape. You're going to need to do a little bit of trial and error again and take a look. If your dart point is too close to your bust apex, it will look as if it's sort of pulling and there isn't enough space in there. If your dart point is too far away, then it will sort of bag and you'll get a bit of a peak, like you need to be filling out that point. Just some things to consider. For this example, I'm going to bring the point of the dart 1 inch, 2.5 centimetres down from the bust apex. And then I'm just going to connect from the dart point to the dart leg. And this has given me a waist dart that has eaten up that extra amount that we added in for the FBA. Now, what if you didn't want a waist dart? It just wasn't right on the garment. Perhaps you don't have a waist seam to put one in. Then the other option is that you take it off the side. You're going to need to measure in the amount that you've added. So that's my 1 inch, 2.5 centimetres. And then you're going to need to grab a French curve. And you're going to want to curve this into the base of the dart. So that gives you 2 options and ways to remove the amount of FBA that you've added all the way down. If you added it all the way down to the hem of the garment, you can do the same thing and just take it off the side, straight at the bottom up into a nice curve into the dart. Now, before you finish, you're going to need to true your dart and true your side seams if you've made an adjustment to those. Again, I have tutorials that show you how to do that. I will pop a link here. So that is how to do a full bust adjustment on a single side dart bodice. As I said before, make a calico toile and see how it fits. See what it looks like and have a look at whether you need to move the position of the dart or just the point of the dart to work with your individual figure. I really hope that you enjoyed the tutorial and that you do feel more confident when it comes to making a full bust adjustment. If you've made one before, then I hope this was a refresher, but if it's your first time, I hope that I've been able to explain it in a way that makes sense. Any questions, as always, let me know, and good luck with your FBA. I will be back here with lots more FBAs and SBAs over the coming weeks, showing you how to make different FBAs depending on the pattern that you're working with. As always, thanks for watching and see you soon.